Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be talking about the misadventures I had as a young composer working with a group known as ERM Media. It was a record company out of Norfolk, Virginia. This tale involves a piece I am presently uploading to YouTube by the name of Scherzo Captain William Hilton's Journey. It was a piece I wrote in 2006 and was one of ERM Media's 2007 Masterworks of the New Era prize winners. Considering how uneconomic modern classical music is, or modern new music, the holy grail of the contemporary composer is achieving a recording of one of their symphonic pieces whereby the recording is both credible in terms of quality and doesn't break the composer's financial situation. The ERM Masterworks Prize offered a credible orchestra and recording. I believe it was the Prague Radio Symphony or Kiev Philharmonic, and they offered that at a relatively low recording price. Also in their contract, they offered to pay a mechanical royalty, which is a royalty generated for every unit product sold or every CD sold that your music was on. And I've forgotten what the rate was, but it's defined by law. But the point here was that ERM was theoretically offering to pay you back after you've paid a little money into the recording. And I figured I could recoup part of my recording cost by both this mechanical royalty and by licensing the recording out to producers in need of production library music. So I went ahead and signed a contract with ERM and sent them the score and the parts to be used for the recording, and sent them a CD of what the piece was supposed to sound like. And a few weeks before the recording session, the conductor called me up and asked me what the tempo was on the music. I had not put a tempo, but I did designate the piece a scherzo, which is traditionally a lively or fast-paced piece of music. And when I communicated the tempo to the conductor, I expressed it in terms of number of dotted quarter notes per minute and was satisfied that he understood. He had the tempo, he had the scherzo marking that it was a lively piece, and he also had a recording I sent him, and thusly I was satisfied that he would do the best he could with the piece. My piece was only 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Some people had quite larger pieces, like full symphonies and such, and they were actually willing to take a plane trip from America over to the Czech Republic or wherever the recording was being made to supervise the recording personally. I did not do this. I thought this was a pretty straightforward piece, no tempo changes or anything else to get hung up on. And I was also not prepared to spend a lot of money getting a plane ticket to go overseas or do all the other nebulous preparations required in penetrating another country. Well, a few days after the recording happened, the conductor emailed me and said the session went well and the musicians enjoyed the piece. From that point to the point the CD was actually released to the public was probably about 1.5 to 2 years. It was recorded in, I believe, 2007 and released on CD in 2009 under the Masterworks of the New Era, I think part 14. And during that interim, I had not heard the piece. Every once in a while, I would email ERM and say, hey, how's this going along? Do you have a release date yet? as I was anxious to hear the piece and actually have access to the piece so I could license it out and recoup some of my recording costs. And I would always get a polite reply from ERM, authored by who I thought were various employees that worked for the company, but which I later found out were by the owner himself and the conductor of my piece, Robert Ian Winston. And he was using aliases to communicate through to make it seem that his record company was, I suppose, bigger than it truly was. But I've also heard that he was using these aliases in promotion of his products. And there was an anecdote floating around several years ago that he was actually called out or criticized for this practice and defended it in saying that it was perfectly normal inside the business to employ this particular promotional technique. Anyway, the content of these replies was roughly homogeneous. It was always that they were delaying the recording because they were getting good radio plays on their previous CDs and they didn't want to oversaturate the market and to try them back in a few months. This went on till 2009 when ERM started releasing their promotional clips of the Masterworks of the New Era Volume 14 CD. And one day, whilst Googling my name, I came across my particular piece, or a clip of such. Upon listening to it, I noticed the tempo of the piece was starkly slower than my original intention. I remember thinking, well, there's something wrong here, but I will wait till the entire recording comes out, and then I will make an assessment of what's going on. That did indeed happen. A few months later, ERM sent me a box of CDs, and I listened to the piece, and indeed it was starkly slower than the previously agreed upon tempo. And this was not a minor variance in interpretation. This was a gross error in practice of the conductor. The piece is intended to be 4 minutes and 30 seconds, and perhaps 5 minutes if the string section is hitting its technical limits with regard to some of the eighth note runs in the piece. But ERM had recorded the piece and it clocked in at something like 7 minutes and 40 seconds, something like that. It was an almost doubling of the length of the piece. The liveliness had been dissolved. The piece was no longer a scherzo, but a plodding, lumbering mule with no regard for the whip. Gone was my chance to recuperate any money through licensing my music to a production office. The heroic brass melodies in the middle of the piece, which would have been nice for action-adventure films and media, kept none of their qualities of action or adventure or heroic sentiments. And upon writing a strongly worded email to one of the fake name accounts at ERM Media, the conductor himself was brave enough to reply under his own name, Robert Ian Winston. Apologies were issued, and a point was then made that I had not marked a tempo on the score, even though it was notated in big bold letters, the words scherzo, and that any seasoned conductor or interpreter of classical music would have at once recognized the gross error in playing the piece that slow. It would be as if I stood up on the podium and said, okay, now we're going to play the Beethoven Fifth, and here's how it's going to go. Bom, 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 bom. The conversation ended with the conductor offering to record this piece or another piece again at half the price of the recording fee, and that was that. I then had to wait, per the contract, something like 6 to 12 months to start accumulating royalties. And there was some comfort in knowing that at least some of these royalties would eventually pay down the cost of the recording. The appropriate time went by and no royalty checks started showing up after they were supposed to be due. And sometime after that, I started talking with a few other composers about the ERM royalties. I believe I talked to one seasoned composer and she said, yes, if you email ERM, they will send you some royalty payments. And that's what she had to do. Also around that time, or shortly after, when I was doing research on ERM media on the internet, I came across a obituary for Robert Ian Winston. Apparently in 2010, June 26, 2010, the conductor and owner of ERM had passed away due to a massive stroke. I then sent out a message to the conductor's wife, who I supposed was the beneficiary of ERM Media, and told her how sorry I was about the passing of the conductor and that I was due some royalty payments. I may have sent one or two messages out over the course of several months and never got a reply from her. The radio silence on her part was a good source of vexation and grievance on mine. CDs were being sold online on Amazon.com and such, and she was collecting money on these and was not or did not intend to pass any of the royalties along to the composers. For a while, I contemplated filing a claim in small claims court in Chicago. That's where any breaches of contract had to be adjudicated. And I even devised a secondary strategy where I would write ERM a letter and say, hey, listen, I'm going to meet you in small claims court in Chicago, and there's a good chance that the court will require any business or corporation to be represented by a lawyer. And not only will that require you to hire a lawyer, but it will also require you to fly that lawyer to Chicago. And if I succeed in court, which is probable because I'm in the right, I'm going to write every other ERM composer and let them know exactly how to go about getting their royalties through the small claims court. Further, I may have a secondary claim where I could argue that since ERM bungled my recording, that they indeed owe me my recording cost back, as I was issued a defective product. Time went by, as it does for a fellow that's always doing 5 things at once, and it seemed there was never a break in my schedule to research the intricacies of small claims court in Chicago, that I would prevail as the victor in my war of attrition against ERM. It took but a few years to lose interest in the venture, which was probably for the best, as later I found out that the royalties were probably quite small, and that any at all that had been paid to the more seasoned composers of the first few Masterworks of the New Era albums were probably done out of the money being paid into the recording costs of the later recordings. Or in other words, it was likely that ERM was running something of a Ponzi scheme, though certainly not comprehensively and not to such a great scale, for there were only dozens of composers, perhaps a few hundred at most, being affected by the scheme. The greater lesson to be learned here is the unprofitability of modern classical music. I believe back in the day it was Naxos's prerogative to record everything they could, which essentially meant that the Beethoven Fifths and the Carmina Buranas would be having to pull in enough revenue to offset the losses on the more obscure albums of lesser-known masters. Well, ERM was chock full of lesser-known masters, and there was a notable absence of Beethovens. Not that we modern composers aren't just as dedicated or clever as the old masters. It's just that the public can only hold so many names in its collective memory, and the Beethovens of the world were there in line a few hundred years before the rest of us. Why do I believe Maestro Winston recorded my score so slowly? And I'm not the only one out there complaining of getting a slow interpretation of their piece, though my particular case may have been the most extreme example. I believe the heart of the matter was, again, economic woes. Not enough rehearsal time was allotted to the piece to discover the technical challenges in the string parts, and perhaps the maestro was hoping to gain a few extra recording dollars, as the recording was billed to the composers on a per minute basis, though I must say he never charged me for the additional minutes he added to my piece. In the end, I speculate ERM was a vehicle for Robert Ian Winston to collect pooled composer money and skim a little off the top and record his own music with such. And the ultimate lesson learned is that if you're going to do a Vanity recording, be sure to be present at the recording. That way you can spot errors and guide interpretation and the like. Okay, we're past the quarter-hour mark, so I will sign off here. I'll try to leave links to the recording I uploaded and one to the Masterworks recording in the description below or on the video. Okay, well, thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.